Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Adam Hochschild. My name is Jamie Madsen, and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator here at Copperfield's, and will also be your host for the evening. Copperfield's Books has been committed to literature, education, and creating community together since our founding in 1981. We're thrilled to be offering free online events during these times to keep our community together while we're forced to be separated. As COVID-19 continues to endanger the future of independent bookstores in free events like this, you can show your support for Copperfield's and help keep us alive by purchasing a book through our online store. Thanks for your continued support. A couple of house cleaning items before I introduce tonight's author. We will be utilizing the chat box to provide links to view upcoming Copperfield's events, links to purchase Adam's latest book, as well as his previous award-winning titles, and we will also include my contact details for post-event questions and information. Sorry, I have an angry, hungry cat. Additionally, the Q&A box will be your go-to with any questions or comments for the author. The format for tonight's event will feature 30 minutes of speaking and will be followed by a live Q&A. We will try to get to as many of your questions as we can, as your feedback is always appreciated. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A icon. Please submit your questions here rather than replying in the chat box, as this will be more convenient for the Q&A portion of the event. And without further ado, I'd love to introduce our speaker for the evening, Adam Hochschild. Adam is a journalist, historian, lecturer, and author of 10 books, beginning his career as a journalist at our very own San Francisco Chronicle. His books delicately tackle the subject of human rights. King Leopold's Ghost was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, as was To End All Wars. His Bury the Chains was a finalist for the National Book Award and won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and PEN USA Literary Award. In addition, he has consulted for the BBC and taught writing workshops for journalists in the US, Britain, Zambia, South Africa, and India. Hochschild currently teaches writing at the Graduate School of Journalism at the UC Berkeley and lives in Berkeley. By a master of narrative nonfiction, his latest title, Rebel Cinderella, From Rags to Riches to Radical, The Epic Journey of Rose Pastor Stokes, unearths the rich, overlooked life of a social justice campaigner who was truly ahead of her time. I'm so looking forward to hearing about the backstory, the history, and the research that went into making this title. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Adam.
Well, thank you very much, Jamie. It's a pleasure to have the chance to talk to you all about my new book. And it's a special pleasure to do it on behalf of Copperfield's, because independent bookstores really need our support, especially during this very pinched economic time. So the book is mostly about this woman, Rose Pastor Stokes, a remarkable but forgotten figure. It's also about her very unusual marriage, and that marriage is, I hope, a window onto life in this country a little more than a century ago, its hopes, its illusions, and its enormous injustices. Let me trace her story first. The woman who would become Rose Pastor Stokes was born in this town, Augustov, in Tsarist Russia in 1879. She was Jewish, but the Jews of Augustov, or at least some of them, did not live in a separate shtetl, because Rose's father, from whom her mother separated very soon after her birth, was a cobbler, and he lived above his shoemaker's shop on this central square of the town. Now, when she was born there, the Russian Empire was then under the rule of Tsar Alexander II. He was the reformer Tsar, the good guy Tsar, the Tsar who freed the serfs. He also eased some of the severe restrictions on Russia's Jews. He was by no means a human rights activist, but let's just say he was considerably less anti-Semitic than many others in the Romanov dynasty. However, the lives of Rose and her family and millions of others were upset by an event that happened 2 years after her birth, hundreds of miles away, in St. Petersburg, the empire's capital. Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. And as soon as he was dead, his successor imposed harsh new restrictions on the Jews of the Russian Empire, and over the next 2 decades, there were a series of pogroms. Hundreds of people were killed, often Jewish homes and shops were burned, leaving their owners homeless. And this, of course, was what spurred the great exodus of millions of Jews out of the Russian Empire. Among them was Rose, 3 years old at the time that she left Russia, and her divorced mother. They stayed first for 7 years in London, living in great poverty in the city's East End. And it was while there that Rose had the only formal schooling she had ever had, 2 years. But this was enough for her to gain the ability to read and write in English and to discover a great love for English poetry. When she was 11 years old in 1890, she and her mother came to the United States, like so many millions of other immigrants, on a packed immigrant ship like this one. They went to Cleveland, Ohio. When they got there, Rose immediately had to go to work at the age of 11 in a factory that made cigars. This is the first picture in which she appears in 1896. She's third from the left in the back row. Here she is closer up in the center of the back row, 16 years old. She was a cigar factory worker for a dozen years. By the end of that time, she was supporting herself, her mother, and 6 younger siblings who had been abandoned by a ne'er-do-well stepfather. For this work, she earned $8 a week, equivalent to about $240 today, not much on which to support a family of that size. And rolling cigars was hard work. The tobacco oil seeped into your clothes, your skin. It was impossible to get rid of the smell. The air was kept humid because otherwise the outer or wrapper leaves of the cigars would dry out. So factory windows were nailed shut in summertime. And very fine tobacco dust filled the air, and it filled workers' lungs. Tobacco workers, cigar factory workers, have the second highest rate of tuberculosis in the United States. Only stonecutters had it worse. Rose would have lung problems as long as she lived. When she was 21 years old, something happened that changed her life. She saw a copy of a Yiddish newspaper published in New York, Yiddish's Tageblatt, or Jewish Daily News. The paper ran one page in English in each issue, and it invited contributors all over the country to send in their anecdotes, their articles, the stories they wanted to tell. And she began doing this. She was amazed one day to get a check for $2 in the mail and realized that she could be paid for writing. Soon the paper gave her a column called Just Between Ourselves Girls that she wrote under the pen name of Zelda. She was even more amazed when, after she'd done this for 2 years, the newspaper invited her to New York to work there writing for its English language page at double the salary she was earning as a cigar worker. So Rose arrived in New York in 1903, 23 years old. And imagine how extraordinary that city looked to someone who was seeing it then for the very first time. Skyscrapers like none she'd ever seen before, elevated trains like this one puffing along above the streets, on the streets themselves, trolley cars pulled by cables like the cable cars that are still there in San Francisco, and then below ground, an enormous network of subways being built that was not yet open. And even on the streets in 1903, here and there, a few of the remarkable new horseless carriages. Now, New York at that time was a city that would have terrified Donald Trump because it was a city of immigrants. More than half the men over 21 in Manhattan, for instance, were foreign born. New York would soon be the largest city in the world. It was already the largest Jewish city on earth. And this is a picture of the Lower East Side, the center of Jewish New York, where Rose lived and worked. And people like these peddlers or the folks who ran the shop that you can see behind him in the picture, these were the kinds of people that she wrote about for the newspaper. But one day in the summer of 1903, after she'd been in the city for about 6 months, her editor gave her a different assignment, which was to go and interview someone who worked at a settlement house. What were settlement houses? You probably know something about them. They were places that brought all kinds of social services to poor neighborhoods, like childhood nutrition programs. They provided baths and showers, not just for kids, but for adults, because in the ghetto areas of America's cities at that time, thousands, tens of thousands of tenements didn't have baths or showers. Settlement houses provided adult education classes in English literacy and many other subjects. Now, settlement houses served populations that were almost entirely immigrant and poor. But the volunteers who staffed them tended to be well-to-do college graduates. This is the settlement house on the Lower East Side, the University Settlement, where Rose was sent to do her interview. And here is the man that she was assigned to interview, a volunteer worker there. James Graham Phelps Stokes, called Graham by his friends. And as you can tell from the name, he was Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He and Rose fell in love. Now, Graham Stokes came from the most different kind of background from Rose's imaginable in this world. Here, for example, is his parents' summer home. When it was built in the Berkshire Mountains of western Massachusetts in the 1890s, it was the largest private home in the United States, 100 rooms. Legend has it that a brother of Graham's, who was in the class of 1896 at Yale, sent a telegram to his mother saying, bringing some apostrophe 96 fellows home for the weekend. The apostrophe got dropped from the telegram, and his mother replied, many guests already here, have only room for 50. Now, if you were writing a novel, somebody who lives in a house like this falls in love with a poor immigrant who spent her life working in cigar sweatshops, nobody would believe it, but it happened. When Graham Stokes' family were not at one of their several summer places like that one, they lived in this mansion in New York City, Madison Avenue and 37th Street. It's part of the Morgan Library today. And here are Graham Stokes' parents. Each of them came from large fortunes, which they combined. The money came from part of the Phelps Dodge mining empire, from New York City real estate, especially luxury apartment buildings on the Upper East Side, and from a cluster of silver and gold mines in Nevada and a railroad that led to them, and more. Graham's parents had 9 children, and they and some of their husbands and wives and offspring are in this picture. The boys in the family were expected to play prominent roles in life, and they did. One of them became a famous architect. One of them became an editorial writer for the New York Times. One of them became what today would be called provost at Yale University. The grandson became an Episcopal bishop. The girls in the family were not expected to have careers, but were expected to marry well, and they did. One married a European nobleman and became a baroness. Another married into the family of a former Secretary of State. But Graham Stokes took a somewhat different route in life from his brothers and sisters. After graduating from college, he went to medical school at Columbia in New York. And while there, working on a horse-drawn ambulance, he was exposed to a very different New York than the one he'd grown up in. It was the New York of the tenements, and he was shocked by what he saw. Immigrants living packed 6, 7, 8 people to a room, tenements where often the only toilets were outdoor outhouses like these. And of course, New York's tenements were notorious for being not just living quarters, but makeshift sweatshops for the city's garment industry. Graham was outraged by what he saw, and that was what led him to become part of the settlement house movement. He and Rose courted secretly for 2 years. Then finally, news of their engagement leaked out and received immense attention. This, for instance, is a page 1 headline from the New York Times. And newspapers across the country reported the story. It was reported in Europe and Australia. Here it is as the lead story on the front page of the New York Evening World. And as you can see, what attracted the public's attention was not just that it was a marriage of someone extremely rich and extremely poor, but of Jew and Gentile, something very unusual for that time. So there was both a class and an ethnic difference in this marriage. And that's exactly what makes us fascinated still with such marriages today, like that of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. This same newspaper immediately signed Rose up to write a series of articles for them, calling her the genius of the ghetto. Finally, despite the well-concealed dismay of Graham Stokes' family, they got married on July 18th, 1905. It was Rose's 26th birthday. Graham was 7 years older than she. The press remained fascinated by this couple, and they lived in a blaze of publicity for years. The core of the public's fascination was that here there seemed to be the classic Cinderella story. Prince Charming comes along and rescues poor, virtuous Cinderella from her humble hearth and brings her to live in his castle. And of course, love will conquer all the differences between them. Here's a photo of Rose taken probably the year after they married. However, their lives did not fit the Cinderella script because Graham, to some degree, had left the castle, and Rose had no desire to live in one. Although they often stayed in one of the lavish houses of his parents, one or another of them, it always made her uncomfortable. She and Graham were both acutely conscious that they lived in a country with enormous disparities of wealth. Some people lived as Graham's family did, others were desperately poor, and often worked in dangerous conditions as well, like these child coal miners in West Virginia. In 1906, the year after they married, Rose and Graham joined the group that they thought had the best answer to such problems, the Socialist Party. Its leader at the time and for many years was Eugene V. Debs, a noble, much beloved man, 5 times a candidate for president. He had begun his life as a railroad worker and then as leader of the Railroad Workers Union. And when he campaigned for president in 1908, it was in a special train called the Red Special with red flags and red bunting. And engineers of passing locomotives, when they saw the Red Special coming down the track, always greeted him with long whistle blasts. Now that year, 1908, Graham was also running for office and was on the platform with Debs when the Red Special came to New York. Graham was running as a socialist candidate for the New York State Assembly from the Lower East Side, and Rose went out and campaigned for him. Neither Graham nor Debs won their races for office, but people still remained fascinated by Rose and Graham. everyone still saw it as a Cinderella story. Their marriage inspired two novels. Here's one of them. And this particular novel was actually turned into a silent film. Unfortunately, the film has been lost, but we still have the promotional photos from it of the actors playing the roles inspired by Rose and Graham. Here's one, and your guess is as good as mine as to what they're saying to each other. Now, this was a time when, despite these Cinderella fantasies, it was a time when millions of Americans, even those not living in great poverty, were becoming aware of the country's injustices. One episode that dramatized the terrible labor conditions of today involved clothing workers. At the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York, just off Washington Square, a terrible fire broke out. Workers were trapped on the upper floor of this building. Most of them were unable to get out. The fire escape was inadequate and collapsed under the weight of people trying to crowd onto it. The door to a stairwell through which the workers could have escaped was locked to keep out union organizers. 146 people burned to death or leapt out the window of the flaming building to their death. Of the dead, almost all were women, half were teenagers, almost all were immigrants, Jewish and Italian. 120,000 people marched in a mourning procession through the streets of New York. More than 300,000 people lined those streets. As Rose continued her journalism, it was issues of labor and social justice that she was now mostly writing about. And also about women's rights. She got involved in one case which has echoes of the kind of battles still going on today in the Me Too era. The case that drew her attention was that of a woman named Sarah Coton, who worked as a nurse for a doctor in New York whose home and office were in the same building. And he gave her a room to live there. And one night when she was asleep, he piped chloroform under her door, and when she was unconscious, he raped her. Some weeks later, she realized she was pregnant. She went out and bought a gun, shot and killed the doctor, and then surrendered to police. Rose went to the prison where she was being held, interviewed her in Yiddish. Sarah Coton told Rose her story at much greater length than she told to anyone else. And Rose announced that she would pay Sarah Coton's legal expenses, and once she was released from prison, would give her and the baby a place to stay. Sarah Coton's trial was delayed until she gave birth, and then she was finally found innocent, in part because another woman who'd been assaulted by the same doctor came forward. Starting a few years after Rose and Graham were married, for a decade or more, the country was convulsed by strikes, with hundreds of workers walking out every year. And this was at a time when labor unions had almost none of the rights that they later acquired. The strikes were often suppressed by police. These are Chicago police arresting a striking worker in that city. Or by troops. These are striking clothing workers in Massachusetts facing the state militia. One big strike was of garment workers in New York City. Rose got heavily involved, speaking to groups of strikers, often many times each day. Actually, if you look at the signs in this picture, you'll see they're in 4 different languages: English, Italian, Russian, and Yiddish. It was in that 1909 strike of New York garment workers that Rose really came into her own as an organizer and as an immensely popular speaker, a natural orator. And she was soon recognized as one of the great radical orators of her time. And this, in the news coverage of them, this eclipsed coverage of her husband. And gradually the ongoing cascade of newspaper stories about them were more about her than about them as a couple. And there are signs that he was not happy about this. One strike that Rose got involved in was of hotel and restaurant workers in New York City in 1912. Um, Organizers would walk into one restaurant or hotel dining room after another, usually just as dinner was about to be served. They blew a whistle, and the waiters walked out. The Waldorf Astoria, Delmonico's, the Luncheon Club of the New York Stock Exchange, on deck. Rose was on the strike committee. She addressed many rallies of striking waiters. She wrote and spoke about the miserable conditions in which they and hotel workers worked. And in her papers, there are many letters of thanks from waiters and hotel workers. One of the hotels whose restaurants were struck was the Ansonia Hotel on Broadway and 72nd Street in New York, 73rd Street, still there today as an apartment building. The largest hotel in the city, had several dining rooms, and the Ansonia was a famous gathering place for musicians, business people, show business people, and mobsters. Its owner was Graham Stokes's uncle, William Earl Dodge Stokes, or Uncle Will, as they called him. He was a passionate hater of labor unions, immigrants, and much else. And he was absolutely furious that his beloved nephew's wife was organizing his own workers to go on strike against him. And you'll see, he later comes back into the story. Let me turn to another aspect of Rose's and Graham's lives. One of the things that made them so fascinating for me to write about was their friends. They knew and worked with the most interesting people in the United States of that era. The people I would have most liked to know if I'd been alive then. Here are some of them. There's Rose with Eugene Debs, whom we talked about before, on the left, and behind them, Max Eastman, editor of The Masses, the country's best magazine by far at the time, in many ways a precursor of The New Yorker. They were also friends with Big Bill Haywood, the leader of the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, the country's most militant labor union, a former miner, cowboy, saloon card dealer, charismatic orator, famous for using his fists when necessary, and for being able to recite long passages of Shakespeare by heart. They were friends with John Reed, probably the finest English language journalist of his generation, with Lincoln Steffens, the king of the muckrakers, with W.E.B. Du Bois, the greatest black intellectual of his time, with Mother Jones, Mary Harris Jones, the great labor organizer. Rose and Graham knew all these people. Upton Sinclair, to whose novel, The Jungle, we owe our food and drug laws. As he was writing it, he sent it chapter by chapter to Graham Stokes for his comments. They were friends with Margaret Sanger, in the middle of this picture, the birth control pioneer. Now, we take access to birth control for granted today, but this Brooklyn clinic where Sanger was photographed was shut down shortly after it opened by the police, and Sanger was sent to jail. Rose was very active in the campaign for birth control when talking about such things openly was against the law. Another friend was Emma Goldman, the anarchist firebrand, shown here in one of the many mugshots that police took of her when they arrested her. She spent quite a bit of time in jail on several occasions. All of these folks, Rose and Graham knew and they worked with and were sometimes their house guests. And many of them left us their recollections of the couple. Goldman, for instance, who was always very blunt, thought Graham was a stuffed shirt and couldn't understand how Rose put up with him. The period of American life when all these people were active was really a remarkable time, a time when all of them believed that the world could be changed and a new and more just society brought into being. Then, however, something happened that brought that period of great confidence and optimism to an end: the First World War. Not only did it kill millions of soldiers and civilians, it also shattered the radicals' dream that the working classes of different countries would never fight against each other. America, however, did not join the war when it began in 1914. American socialists and other radicals agitated very strongly for their country to stay out of the war. Rose, Emma Goldman, and many others joined something called the Women's Peace Party, took part in demonstrations like this. However, in the spring of 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before Congress and asked it to declare war. And American troops began going to France soon in huge numbers, and by mid-1918 were heavily involved in the most fierce fighting of the war. Here at home, the country was swept by war fever and by ferocious government propaganda, like this Army enlistment poster. There was tremendous paranoia about spies. And that paranoia was directed against anti-war radicals. I don't think you can read the caption at the top of this cartoon, but it says at the top, "Now for a roundup." And there's Uncle Sam rounding up all manner of subversives and traitors. Many radicals still felt strongly that the war was a huge mistake, but they were harassed or arrested when they spoke out. The war created a rift between Rose and Graham. She became firmly convinced that it had been a terrible mistake for the United States to join the First World War. Graham was so enthusiastic about the war that he enlisted and went into uniform. He was too old to be sent overseas, but he served for several years in the New York National Guard, although he never got closer to combat than marching in a parade down Fifth Avenue like this one. Something else that divided Rose and Graham also happened in 1917. The second stage of the Russian Revolution, when the Bolsheviks took power. Rose was for this, Graham was against it. Rose continued speaking out loudly against the war and now in favor of the Russian Revolution. And this drew the rage of many people, including Graham's uncle, the angry hotel owner. Remember him? Here's a report about him from the files of the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor of the FBI. And as you can see, he's telling them that Rose had had meetings with wobblies and socialists at her house, and that if a search was made, they would find useful information. A few days later, after the conversation recorded in this report, he called the Bureau and told them that Rose and Graham would be out of town and that it was a particularly good chance to search the house. And they did. The Bureau kept a close eye on Rose. Agents followed her. Stenographers transcribed her speeches. And after one anti-war talk, she was arrested. This happened in the summer of 1918. She was put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to 10 years in prison for speaking out against the war. Graham Stokes put up bail money. They appealed the case, and eventually the sentence was overturned on appeal and she didn't have to go to jail. But by this point, their marriage was on the rocks. They remained together for 7 more years, but very uneasily because they were going radically different directions in politics. Rose joined the Communist Party, and in 1922, she actually went to Russia as an American delegate to a meeting of the Communist International. Like far too many people at that time, she believed that in Russia she had found paradise. Graham looked for paradise in a different direction. He abandoned all his interest in progressive politics and became deeply absorbed in religion, particularly in blending the traditions of Christianity and Hinduism. Finally, in 1925, they got divorced very bitterly, and this put them back on the front pages for the very last time. As soon as they were no longer a couple, the press lost interest in them. But happily for me, they saved all their letters. Rose kept a diary, and they wrote dueling memoirs. So there was rich material to work from to reconstruct their relationship and the ringside seat they had to this quite remarkable period of American history. So, do historians a favor, keep diaries, save your letters. It gives us something to work from. After the divorce, Graham remarried, but made no great leap out of his class this time. He married the daughter of a railroad executive, and he lived to the age of 88, dying in 1960. Rose, when they got divorced, as a matter of principle, refused to accept any alimony, and she was reduced to poverty again. She remarried, but to someone as poor as she. She soon fell ill with cancer, and she died at the age of 53 in 1933. So that's their story. I wish I could say they changed the world. They didn't, but perhaps through their eyes we can see a world that needed changing and that still does today. I hope you'll enjoy getting to know them as much as I did. And I would be glad to hear comments and questions.
Wow. I That was a remarkable story. Thank you so much for taking the time to make those slides. It's so interesting to me the parallels between today and then, as well as your ability to kind of not have any bias in it. And today the narrative and the news, it's all kind of opinion and not really fact-based. So I commend you and honestly wonder how you managed to walk that line.
Well, when you're writing history, if it's not to be fictionalized, you do have to stick with the facts. And, if you quote something that somebody says, you have to say where it came from, which letter, or which newspaper article, or which diary entry, or whatever. It doesn't mean you can't have feelings about what you're writing about and show those feelings in your writing. I mean, I rejoice in writing about the way in which Rose and Graham and the people around them at that time became so aware of the injustices in this country, its enormous inequalities, which are still with us today, and how idealistic they were about changing it. I felt sad when Rose believed she'd found paradise in the Soviet Union. So you're allowed to have those feelings, but you still have to stick to the facts when you write.
Well, it's so appreciated. And how long did you spend writing this book? How did you get such a rich background of the history?
Well, that period of history has always fascinated me, and I'd spent some time living there before. My book, To End All Wars, is also about the First World War, but the First World War as it affected Britain. So I knew something about that time and place. It took me 2.5 years of research and writing to do this book. Um, Most of my other books have taken quite a bit longer. To End All Wars required 6 years. But
Wow.
in this case, the basic research material was this enormous corpus of letters between the two of them, the memoirs they each wrote, the diary that Rose kept. That was the basic stuff. Um, and, I did find a lot of other written material, by people who'd known them and so forth. But the basic stuff was relatively small in quantity compared to what some of the things I've worked on for my other books.
And are any of those diary entries included in the book?
Oh yeah, I quote from the diary,
That's
and I wish she'd kept it longer. It was only for a few years, but she was very forthright in putting down her feelings there. Graham was a very buttoned up guy, and never in any letter that I could find, and I looked through hundreds, if not thousands, of his letters, never really confided his feelings about anything to anybody. Didn't keep a diary, and when he wrote a memoir, this was long after they divorced, it was a 260-page memoir which never mentioned the woman he'd been married to for 20 years. Rose, on the other hand, in her memoir, was very frank and open and honest about the marriage, about what had attracted her to him in the beginning, and how she got disillusioned later on. So she to me was much the more interesting member of this couple.
Wow. We've got a question from Catherine. She's wondering if there's any evidence whether Rose and Graham made any inroads in the high society of the Stokes family. Were any persuaded to work on behalf of the underprivileged?
Yes, Graham had a sister, Helen Stokes, who was also part of the socialist movement and who remained in it all her life. And a sort of tribute to her is that she has a considerable file kept on her by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. Um, and I was quite moved. I gave a talk about this book. Actually, it was the book appeared the week before the virus shut everything down. So I was able to give a few talks to live audiences. One of them was in a bookstore in Washington, D.C., and several members of the Stokes family came to that talk. These would be grand nephews of Graham Stokes. Graham and Rose didn't have any children. Several members of the family came, and these were good people. You know, one had worked for the Peace Corps for some years. The other was doing something with microfinance for poor countries. And the family actually did have something of a philanthropic tradition. Uh, Graham and one of his brothers were longtime people on the board of Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institution, for instance.
Wow, that's incredible. Now, Rob Jennings Teets is wondering, you say that they did not change history. Do you really believe that Rose did not have an impact on America?
I think she did have an impact on the audiences she talked to. One of the few frustrating things for me in writing this book was that it was just a decade or two too early for there to be audio and video of Rose. And so I was never actually able to hear or see one of her speeches. But there is account after account after account in the letters that people wrote her, in articles that newspaper reporters wrote about occasions where she talked, where people said, this is the most extraordinary speech I've ever heard. One newspaper reporting, people wouldn't leave the hall even when they turned the lights off after she'd finished talking. Um, so yes, she certainly did have an inspirational effect on people. And I especially admire her forthrightness and bravery in speaking out against the madness of the First World War at a time when there was a tremendous amount of patriotic hoopla in the air, uh, which had a very nasty edge to it, where people who spoke out against the war in this country were tarred and feathered, were spat upon, were treated in horrible ways, and many of them were sent to jail. Rose was sentenced to jail, but eventually that sentence got overturned. So I admire her bravery on that score.
Yeah. And have you ever gotten your hands on Graham's book?
The memoir that he kept, that
Yeah.
we yes, actually, it was not published, but I read it and I've quoted from it.
Great. Now, Catherine is also wondering, when they were young and newly married, what were their relations with her family like?
Uh, Quite friendly. Rose, as I mentioned, had 6 younger siblings, actually half siblings, because her mother, after arriving in this country, had these children, who then got abandoned by the father. And the mother and some of the children actually lived with Graham and Rose for some of the time during the first few years that they married, after they were
Wow. What an interesting dichotomy to go from one to the other.
married. I know. I
Wow.
know. You have to appreciate, give Graham some credit for allowing that to happen.
Absolutely. I give them both credit.
Yeah.
I can't imagine the pressure to be written about in newspapers around the world would be intense.
Yeah.
So a few people are wondering about Graham and his book on Hinduism and Christianity. Was that the memoir, or how is?
No, that was not the memoir. And I have to confess, I didn't read the book on Hinduism and Christianity. I just knew he had this long-standing interest in blending the traditions of different religions. And he went to India a couple of times, I believe. And in the house where he lived, this originally had been the house where Graham and Rose lived together, but then she stalked out very angrily in 1925, and they got divorced subsequently. And he lived on there for more than 30 years with his second wife, and he had a room that was filled with uh, uh, both Christian and Hindu uh, religious objects and statues of one sort or another, and he would invite friends in for meditation sessions there. But these were separate writings from the memoir that he wrote.
Wow. I just went ahead and shared the link again to the hardcover, which is a beautiful hardcover. And I gotta ask, what's next?
Well, after you go and buy this book at Copperfields, wait for my next book, which I'm working on right now, which is partly about this same period. It's a book about the United States in the years 1917 to 1921, where I think this was the most Trumpian period of American history before Trump. It was a time when the air was filled with venom against immigrants, against refugees, when there were calls for mass deportations. And it was a time when things happened that Trump would like to do, but so far hasn't been able to do, such as press censorship on a large scale, which was done initially on the excuse that now the United States was in the First World War, wartime, you censored the press. But it continued for more than 2 years after the war. And this stuff is left out of high school history books. It doesn't appear there. It doesn't appear that, under the Espionage Act, the act that Rose was tried under, an amended version of which is still in effect, incidentally, 2,000 people in this country were sent to prison for things that they wrote or said. Almost all in 1917 and 1918, although many of them didn't, because of appeals, they didn't actually begin serving their prison sentences until 1919. So this period of extreme political repression, not to mention the lynchings which happened during that time, a few of them of white people as well as black people, on a large scale, this gets left out of the history books, and that's what I'm focusing on for the next book.
That's exciting. We've got a couple last questions funneling in here. I hope you're okay with it.
Sure.
So was it your research in World War I that led you to know about Rose?
No, it was my research on something else, and here's what it was. Years ago, about 25 years ago, I published a book about Russia. It was called The Unquiet Ghost, Russians Remember Stalin. And it was based on living in what was then still the Soviet Union, the last year of the Soviet Union's existence, when it became possible to talk about the Stalin era. And I was fascinated by how people remembered that time. And I went around the country looking where people were digging up mass graves, and I interviewed former Gulag prisoners and so forth. Anyway, I read a lot of Soviet history during that time. And at one point came across a photograph of the American delegates to the 1922 meeting of the Communist International in Moscow. And here was this quite striking looking woman with this New York high society name, Stokes. And I wondered, could she be related to that Stokes family that owned all that real estate and that's connected to the Phelps Dodge fortune and so forth? I was in the middle of writing this other book at that time, and I got distracted by a couple of more books after that. But then when I was casting around for a book subject 4 or 5 years ago in reading a book about early 20th century, I saw her name again and was reminded of this photograph I'd seen. And then, as is always the case in things I write about, I can never claim to be the first person to discover it, because other people have written about Rose, but it's an article in a scholarly journal here, a PhD thesis there, academic monograph somewhere else. So she's not known in the way that I think she deserves to be today.
Well, I'm sure you did her great justice. And because of COVID, I haven't been able to get my arc of your book. So I'm really excited to get back into the office and start thumbing through it.
Good.
I want to thank you again, Adam. This has been a great event. And for all of you watching, thank you for coming out this evening. This will be recorded and you will receive a follow-up email in the next couple of days with links to purchase both his latest title and previous titles and where to watch and share the recording. So thank you, everyone, and hope to see you all back soon. Adam, good luck and stay well.
Thank you, Jamie. Stay safe.
Thanks. Have a good evening.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.